Hey, everybody, it's Tommy Canale, and welcome back to Before the Lights podcast, the show to find out how those in sports, music, and entertainment made their mark. Joining us once again is a 16-time New York Times bestseller. He has 21 books with more in the making, a producer, journalist, known for his celebrity biographies, an entertainment news reporter on Entertainment Tonight, Good Morning America, Today, CBS This Morning, and CNN Headline News. Please welcome back to the show, J. Randy Taraborelli.
Good to be back, Tommy. Thank you for having me again.
Absolutely. I'm excited to put you back on a bonus show. I've been wanting to do a bonus show, and I think you're the perfect guest to have on that. Let's just go from here. I know that you were introduced to Mary Wilson at a very young age. Was there any other career path for you and your idea before you get into, hooking up with her and doing a fan club with Mary Wilson?
Not really, because, I met the Supremes when I was 10. And so I didn't really have time, to have another idea in mind. I just knew that I wanted to be in show business, and I planned to work for the Supremes until, I was like 65 and retire on their pension plan. That was my goal when I was 10. And so, to answer your question, I was always sort of a careerist. I mean, as a young kid, I had an office. When I was working for the Supremes, I was paying taxes by the time I was 12.
Wow.
I had my own office. I had a phone. I was making international phone calls. And, back in the 70s, international phone calls were, that was not commonplace.
Right.
Even calling coast to coast was a big deal back in the 1970s. If you were going to call California, you really had to give it a lot of thought, because that was going to cost a lot of money, and I was raised in the suburbs of Philadelphia. So to answer your question, no, I just fell right into the Supremes right away.
I remember when I was a kid growing up, as you'll remember this, there was a time like 6, 7 o'clock where it was cheaper to call long distance than it was at one time you could call only local.
I forgot about that. I totally forgot about that. That's right. I had an uncle who lived in Spain, and I completely forgot to this very moment that we would wait until a certain time of night.
Right.
And then we'd race to the phone, and everybody in America was calling out of the country or across the country at this same time.
Right.
So you really had to get there fast, because otherwise you weren't going to be able to get through. And so we would all sit, in front of the telephone and wait for 7 o'clock to come. And as soon as the clock struck 7, we would dial the number real fast and try to get through. I really totally forgot about that until right now. That's a good memory.
Yeah, when you brought up the international call, that's what triggered it. In 1984, you were the editor-publisher of Soul magazine. How did this idea come about, and how much fun did you have putting this together?
Well, when I was a kid, I used to read Soul. Soul was a Black entertainment publication. And they used to send one copy of Soul to my neighborhood, because I lived in an Italian white neighborhood. They would send one copy of this magazine to the neighborhood, to the local store, and I would go there in Morton, Pennsylvania, and buy my copy from the time I was 8 years old. And so when I got to Los Angeles, I started working. I continued working for the Supremes for about a year. And then they let me go. The group was having trouble, and they let me go. And I was 18 years old, no college education, didn't know what I was going to do with my life, and decided that I was going to become a writer. The only problem was that I was a terrible writer. So I went to Soul, and I said, look, I've been reading you guys since I was, 8 years old. I've written a lot of letters to the editor, and you've published them. And now I think I want to write some articles for you guys. And I remember that Regina Jones, who was the publisher of the magazine, she said to me, it's very different writing a letter to the editor and writing an actual article in a magazine. But she gave me a shot, and I was pretty terrible. But, my first interview was with the Harlem Globetrotters, and I did the best I could. And I managed to do a story, and then she sent me out again to interview Robert Guillaume, who was the star of a TV show, Benson at that time, back in the 70s. And one thing led to another. And eventually I became the editor and then the publisher of this magazine that I had been reading since I was a little boy. And I remember going through, at that time, everything, all the subscriptions were cataloged in a file cabinet, no computers or anything. And I remember going through the subscriptions and finding that one copy that was being sent to my hometown in Pennsylvania. And it was still being sent. The only problem was that nobody was buying it because now I was in Los Angeles, and they kept sending this one copy back to LA as unsold. And it was the copy that I used to buy when I lived in Morton, Pennsylvania.
Love that. That is awesome. Jay Randy, for advice for people that are writers, how much work is done after you've written the book and then have to edit it, cover design, etc.?
You know, that's a great question, because a lot of the real work begins after the book is written. It might take me 2 years to write a book. And then on the day that it's delivered, you have this sense, okay, well, that's done. It is far from done. Because first of all, you've got to write the source notes, which for me is the greatest agony of all time. Because source notes is just page after page after page of here's where I got this from, here's where I got that from. After 25 books, my impulse right now is my source notes should say, look, if you don't trust me by now, then I'm good with that. And just let that be my source notes, right? Because it's tough. I mean, that's a lot of work. And then, you've got to, license the photographs, and then, it goes to fact checkers, it goes to copy editors, proofreaders, it comes back to you 6 or 7 times. And it's never actually right. Even when it finally comes out, you're going to find typographical errors in all books, which drives me mad. So to answer your question, the work isn't really over until the day that you pick it up in the bookstore. And even then, my inclination is to start adding stuff into the margins that I didn't get to write when I was writing the book.
How important then are reviews?
Oh, that's another good question. I would love to say, I don't pay attention to reviews. I don't care what people think about my work. Believe me, anybody who tells you that is lying to you, because you want good reviews. Nothing is more devastating. To be honest with you, nothing is more devastating than the crappy review that you get on Amazon as soon as the book comes out. And I got to say, 99.9% of the time, that crappy 1-star review is from somebody who hasn't read the book. It's from somebody who's a real fan of the subject, who's mad at you because you wrote the book, who didn't read the book, couldn't possibly read the book because it just came out that day, right? Mm-hmm. So they haven't had time to read. My books are like 600 pages long. It's going to take you some time to read it. And man, that first crappy review, and I got one on the Kennedy Heirs the day it came out. The reason why it's so devastating is because they keep that review on top, And if you go to Amazon and you check out my reviews on the Kennedy Heirs, they're like glowing. I'm blessed with really good reviews and good readers, who've given me good reviews. But the very first review of that book is that crappy review. And that's the one people see as soon as they go to Amazon for the Kennedy Heirs. Check that out sometime. So to answer your question, reviews are important because people pay attention to them, but you have to not write your books for accolades. You've got to try to keep some distance from what people are saying about your work. I try not to go on Twitter. I try not to Google my name. But every now and then, you're laying in bed in the middle of the night and you think, I wonder what they're saying about me on Twitter. And so you check it out, and it's the thing that will keep you up. Let's put it that way.
I can imagine. What resonates most with you when I ask you about the day you co-anchored the coverage of Michael Jackson's funeral with Katie Couric?
First of all, it was an honor to work with Katie Couric on that. It was hard for me because Michael Jackson and I were friends, and we'd been friends since I was a little kid. I think we met when I was 14 and he was 12. So that was hard. And it was emotional, but it was also such an honor to do it and to work with Katie Couric like that. I thought she was amazing. I was so impressed with her. The thing that stands out in my mind about her is that when it was over, she gathered everybody who had been involved on the crew, and me and anybody else who, she could find. And, she stood there and she applauded, and I was so amazed by that, because you think that somebody of her stature would be really sort of jaded by any kind of good experience. But she really appreciated how well that went. And she stood there and she applauded us. And then everybody started to applaud her. And it was just a real sort of great moment. I thought that it was really a memorable day.
You said that you were friends for a long time with Michael Jackson. Did you ever get to visit Neverland?
Many times. I was actually at Neverland before Michael even bought it.
Wow.
Paul McCartney filmed his video, Say, at Neverland. And so Michael didn't live there yet, and he really loved it. And he used to tell me, you could take all of Havenhurst, which is where he had lived as a kid and where he was still living, Havenhurst Avenue in Encino. He said you could take all of the Havenhurst property and stick it right in that little corner at Neverland. His people didn't want him to buy Neverland. They wanted him to buy the house that was used in the Beverly Hillbillies TV show. And they wanted him to buy that house. They were going to tear it down, and they were going to buy all of the property around it and have sort of a Michael Jackson sort of enclave right there. They wanted him to be in Beverly Hills because they just felt that he should be more accessible. But Michael wanted to live out there, man. And I'll tell you, I was against it. I loved Neverland, but I was against Michael isolating himself out there, because Michael's tendency was to isolate. And I thought this is the perfect opportunity for this kid to never see anybody, And so I wasn't a big fan of the idea of him buying Neverland, but once he was out there, I mean, I did spend a lot of time there, and it really was the most incredible place to live. After he died, I went back to Neverland, and I was hired by CBS Television to do a tour of Neverland for its viewers, and every network had one guy out there. ABC had somebody, NBC had somebody, CNN had somebody, CBS had me. And the only problem that they all had was that none of those people had ever been to Neverland, right? And the bigger issue was that it was empty. There was no furniture. So you could not tell which was the living room, which was the dining room, which was this, which was that. The only thing you could tell for sure was which was the kitchen, right? Mm-hmm. But these were gigantic empty rooms that none of those guys knew, what belonged to what. And so I remember they were all coming over to me saying, what was here? What was there? What was here? What was there? And CBS didn't want me to tell anybody anything because they wanted to. Yeah, because it was exclusive. The fact that I had spent so much time in Neverland was kind of an exclusive thing for the network, and I felt bad because I had to tell, the other folks, I can't really say, but you can kind of imagine. And they got it all wrong, man. They thought that the dining room was the living room. They didn't know which room was Michael's bedroom, and they got it all wrong, but I got it right, and it was quite an experience, but also very sad, too, because Michael was gone, and Michael had never seen that place unfurnished. Michael bought that place furnished. So he never saw it completely empty the way that we were looking at it that day. I had never seen it empty. And when I walked in there and there was no furniture, it was really a striking moment, And I also had, not to keep going on about this, but I had this really strange moment, sort of an amazing moment, actually. I wrote about it in my book, of going into Michael's bathroom and looking at myself in Michael's mirror. And it was sort of this man in the mirror kind of moment for me when I was staring at my image in Michael's mirror. And I wondered how many hours he had stared at that same image of himself, dissatisfied with his appearance. Because Michael had sort of he had such an insecurity about the way he looked. And I was standing in this spot, and I had never been in Michael's bathroom. There's no reason that I would ever have gone into Michael's bathroom. He had like 50 other bathrooms in the house, So I had never been in his room before, actually, or never been in his bedroom. No reason to go in his bedroom. Never been in his bathroom. And in this moment, I was standing in his bathroom, looking at my reflection in the mirror and really trying to come to terms with Michael's death. It was really a very emotional moment for me.
I bet it was. These days, what is Neverland now? Is it just empty, closed up?
No, I can't really speak to it because I don't pay too much attention to what goes on these days, but I know that it's been purchased by somebody. I think his name is Ron Burkle. And I believe that they're trying to restore it and, and bring it back to its, original luster, but I don't know too much about it, but it's definitely empty. To my knowledge, nobody's living there, but I think they're trying to restore it. And I think they're going to try to do something with it.
That'd be great. It'd be an attraction for people that want to go there, I'm sure, if they get it back up to what it was.
Yes.
2014, you wrote The Hiltons, a family dynasty. How complex was Conrad Hilton?
Well, The Hiltons was a hard book for me because I knew absolutely nothing about the Hiltons. The Hiltons was the only book that I ever wrote that was not my idea. Usually I have an idea, I pitch it to a publisher and they're going to go for it or they're not going to go for it. Often they don't go for it, but it's a back and forth that has to do with an idea that I had. With the Hiltons, my publisher came to me and they said, we want to do a book about the Hiltons. We want the name Hilton on a book with your name, and we don't care what's inside the book. We just think that that's going to be a bestseller. Your name, their name, bestseller. So I was, I said, okay, I could do that. I only knew I didn't want to write a book about Paris Hilton. Not that I don't like Paris, because I do. I've interviewed her many times and she's great. But I didn't want to do a book about Paris Hilton. So I knew it was going to be about Conrad. I knew it was going to be about the 1940s and 50s. But I really didn't know anything else about it, and it turned out to be such a great project. And he was such a great man and such a great American and a great patriot. And that book is really, people love that book. I just think the Conrad Hilton was incredible. He was the first man to put televisions in hotel rooms. He was the first man to put telephones in hotel rooms. He was the first to, he sort of revolutionized the idea of a press junket, which is when, back then he would get all the stars together that he could get and he'd fly them to his hotel openings and they would be there for the openings and they would have their picture taken at the hotel. And this would give his opening such an international sort of celebrity appeal. He was an innovator, and I think he was an incredible man.
Was Zsa Zsa Gabor just a major thorn in his side?
Well, I interviewed Zsa Zsa Gabor when I was a kid. I loved her. She was a thorn in his side, but he was the love of her life, and I think she was the love of his. Mm. I mean, they divorced and he didn't remarry for like 40 years. And he finally remarried about a year and a half before he died, when he was like 88, 89 years old. But for that entire 40 years, she married over and over again. He did not. And they had a child together, Francesca, which kept them in each other's lives. And when you read the book, The Hiltons, you get the sense of these two people who, divorce is never easy and exes don't often get along. I mean, it's not, this is not unusual. And they often did not get along, but they often did. And I am writing right now a TV show based on my book, The Hiltons. And it's so much fun to write about that relationship, because it was, so complicated And people ask me all the time, what was it like? What was it like? What was it like? Well, my answer to that has to be, well, what year are you talking about? Because, 40 years is a long time. Yeah. And nothing is the same. I mean, your relationship with your ex is one thing when you first break up with that person. It's another thing a year later. It's another thing 10 years later. You have a child. It's going to be something else when that kid graduates from college. I mean, you're stuck together. And these two people were stuck together. And I love that. I love the humanity of that. And I love that story.
The Children Alone is an entire book and series just on that. Conrad and Zsa Zsa Gabor is a hell of a topic. Looking forward to seeing that TV pilot get done with you. 2015, he did Becoming Beyonce, The Untold Story. Jay Randy, what was that media frenzy like before the book was even launched?
It was incredible. I mean, that book it's like I should do a master class on that book, because that book tells you all you need to know about being a biographer, because that book was the most anticipated book probably of all time, and put it that way. Because I was the guy who wrote Call Her Miss Ross, and everybody thought that the guy who wrote Call Her Miss Ross, now writing about Beyonce, this is going to be huge. And that book came out and we got so much attention, and I did so much media, and we broke that book on the Wendy Williams show, and it was incredible. She was so great. And everybody in the studio audience had a copy of the book under their seat, but they didn't know it until we were on the air. And Wendy said, if you look under your chair, you'll find a copy of the book. Everybody in the audience looked under the chair. They saw the book and they went absolutely crazy. I mean, you would have thought that we had given them new cars, right? It was incredible. We got a lot of it. We got the front page of the New York Daily News. I mean, incredible intention on that book, which turned out to be my poorest selling book of all time. Like, despite all of that, guess what? Nobody bought it. Like, nobody bought that book. And that is a really good book that nobody bought. I mean, that book didn't sell. I mean, I don't know, man. If 100 people bought that book, I'd be amazed.
Wow.
And it's such a surprise. But what we learned was that Beyonce's audience doesn't read books. They like Instagram and TikTok, and that's where they get most of their information. And my audience was like, I'm not really into Beyonce, So so they didn't buy it either. So, it just shows you really have to think about your audience. I thought my Michael Jackson, Diana Ross audience would buy the Beyonce book, but it turns out she's from another generation and they just weren't interested. And we totally miscalculated it. But I do have to say in our defense that we had a lot of discussion about that before the book came out. And we were not sure that it was going to be a success. We only became convinced because of the cyclone of media attention around it. But it also goes to show you that no matter how much attention you get, I mean, I was on Entertainment Tonight. I mean, I was on Inside Edition. I was on Access Hollywood. I mean, all you saw was J. Randy Taraborelli on television talking about this book. And it just goes to show you that you cannot shove something down people's throats. Like either they're going to buy it or they're not going to buy it. And you can't convince people to buy something if they're not into it. So, I mean, I have had, I guess, 16 New York Times bestsellers, so I can't complain. I mean, just because that one didn't work didn't discourage me. I mean, you'd have to be crazy to think that every book that you write is going to be accepted. But when you think of Beyonce and you think of how famous she is and how popular she is, and when you think about me telling you right now that that's my poorest selling title, I think that's kind of interesting.
Very interesting. What is not one of your poorest selling titles is the 2018 Jackie, Janet, and Lee, a #1 Amazon, #10 New York Times bestseller. To understand Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, you are basically a Kennedy family historian. Jay Randy, what was the bond like with her mother? Let's start there on that book.
Well, the Jackie, Janet, and Lee, happened because of the Beyonce failure.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, okay, you know what? I got to go back to my roots. I mean, I like, if you're never going to see me do Taylor Swift. Let me put it to you that way. I learned my lesson, right? And I was like, what do I want to do that would be something that's never been done before, that people would, sort of expect of me, but yet would surprise them. And no one had ever done a book about Jackie's mom, Janet Auchincloss, and her relationship to Jackie and Jackie's sister, Lee Radziwill. And so I took that on, and it was a huge success, which put me back, on the New York Times list after the failure of Beyonce. And they had such a complicated relationship, but I love Janet Auchincloss, and, primary source for that book was her only son, Jackie and Lee's brother, half brother. They had the same mom, Janet. His name is Jamie Auchincloss. And when you have somebody in the family who is the only son and the only half brother, and he's your source, you can't go wrong. You cannot go wrong. And so, yeah, I mean, I loved that book, and I'm actually writing that for TV right now. And there are some surprises because I'm doing another Jackie book that's coming out in a year. And so there are some surprises in that show that people don't know about because the other book hasn't come out yet. But I am doing another Jackie book. It's coming out for the 60th anniversary of the assassination next year.
Wow. Now that's intriguing. J. Randy, what is the mystery that surrounds Jackie, Janet, and Lee?
Well, for me, the mystery was that no one had ever written about it before. Nobody had ever thought about it. The Kennedys loom so large in our culture that nobody ever thought about Jackie's side of the family. They only looked at Jackie through the Kennedys. And I always thought that was wrong, because the Bouviers and the Auchinclosses, that was her family. I mean, the original title of that book, by the way, was The Other Side of Camelot, which I loved, but my publisher didn't. So, and by the way, I don't get to title my books. I think people don't know that authors do not get to title their books. You have a title in mind, lots of luck, because it's not going to get used, right? So the title of that book was The Other Side of Camelot when I wrote it, because that's really what the book is about. And the mystery of it is that no one had ever thought about her side of the family prior to that book, and no one had ever written about Janet. And I was really happy to be the guy to do it.
Listeners, go to the show notes. I'm going to put a link to jrandytaraborelli.com where you can purchase all these books. There's also going to be a link to the first interview I did with J. Randy Taraborelli as well, and you can hear more insight to our interview that we did about 6 months ago. 2019, the Kennedy Heirs, John, Caroline, and the New Generation, a legacy of triumph and tragedy. What did this book expose possibly that people may not have known?
Oh my gosh, there's so much in that book. That's such an interest. It was such a great project for me because that book is about the next generation. That book is about the children of Jack, Bobby, Ted.
Let me stop you there and back up then. Let's go here. Who is Ethel Kennedy?
Ethel Kennedy was Bobby Kennedy's wife. They had 11 children. And I wrote a book in 2000 called Jackie, Ethel, and Joan, The Women of Camelot. And that book was the first time anybody had ever taken a look at the three women who married into the Kennedy family. Jackie Bouvier, who became Jacqueline Kennedy, Ethel Skakel, who became Ethel Kennedy when she married Bobby, and Joan Bennett, who became Joan Kennedy when she married Ted. So that's what that book was about. And then many years later, I did the Kennedy Heirs, which was about their children. And so in the Kennedy Heirs, you get to read about, John Kennedy Jr., who I interviewed a couple of times along the way. You get to read about Carolyn Kennedy and all of Ethel's children and Ted and Joan's kids. And also, Eunice Kennedy, who was married to Sergeant Shriver. Their daughter, one of their children is Maria Shriver, who is, Eunice and Sergeant's daughter. It was such a great project. There's such interesting people, and with an unusual kind of pressure in their lives, being the children of Camelot. Many of them, had problems over the years. Ethel Kennedy's son David died of a drug overdose, and Jean Kennedy's son. What was it? I can't remember his name right now, but he was accused of rape back in the 1990s, and there was a huge trial. William Kennedy Smith, and so I think that it's a great story with a great ending. Everybody turned out okay, and I love it. I think it's a really good book, The Kennedy Heirs. I hope people pick it up.
Get to the show notes, listeners. Jay Randy, is there someone that keeps popping in your mind that you always say, I need to write a book about that person, but just haven't done it yet, but you still want to?
Well, there are people who come up to me all the time and say, I love your book on Oprah Winfrey, which I've never written a book on Oprah Winfrey. But it just seems to everybody that, of course, I've written about Oprah Winfrey. That's just like, and people will say to me, your book on Barbra Streisand was so great. I've never written about Barbra Streisand ever, but I would love, and those are the two subjects that I would like to do one day: Barbra Streisand and Oprah Winfrey. I'm just afraid that if I ever do them, people won't buy them because they'll figure I already bought that book. But I think that those are two subjects that I've always wanted to write about. I think that they're great women, and maybe one day I'll have that opportunity. Those
are two fantastic names that probably have great storylines that you could dig into, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The value of time is important to all of us because we all have so much. But how do you take your time and put a value on what you're going to do next? Because you have so many projects going at once.
Well, the only way I can explain it is that I keep a Post-it on my computer every day, and it schedules my day, and I stick to the schedule. It'll say something. I start working at 4:00 in the morning, and it'll say something like 4 to 6 Jackie, 6 to 8 Hilton's, 8 to 10 something else, lunch, then 1 to 2, and I stick to it because if I don't, I will only get one thing done that day, and I have too many things to do to just get one thing done. So I think that my advice to anybody who is a multitasker and has a lot of things on, a lot of coals in the fire, is to schedule your day so that and then stick to it so that you can achieve everything that you want to achieve, as opposed to just achieving one thing. Now there are other people who are like, who feel like that means you're going to get a whole lot of things done, but you're never going to finish anything. Right. Well, obviously that's not true because I finish things, but you do have to, as a writer, especially, you have to schedule your time in order to achieve your goals. And if you don't, you're just never going to finish anything.
Jay Randy, thanks so much for coming back on Before the Lights, talking to me once again. I really appreciate your time doing this.
Tommy, thank you. It's good talking to you again.
Follow Jay Randy on Instagram at Taraborelli. Follow me on Instagram at Before the Lights Podcast. If you need merch, go to beforethelightspod.com/merch. That's beforethelightspod.com/merch. Thank you for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. And until next time, everybody, I salute a chin chin.